Welcome to episode 336 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agent Kirk McKenzie, who served in the FBI for 24 years. In this episode, Kirk reviews his Russian birth tourism investigation, which targeted boutique companies in South Florida that specialized in assisting pregnant Russian mothers with giving birth in the U.S. in order to circumvent visa requirements and illegally secure American citizenship for their newborns. The case took a surprise detour when the owner of Miami Mama, one of the birth tourism companies, was discovered to also be involved in sending military-grade night vision and thermal vision rifle scopes to Russia. The U.S. State Department bans these devices from being exported. During the first 3.5 years of Kurt's FBI career, he was a forensic biologist at FBI headquarters, analyzing DNA evidence from sex crimes, serial murders, and other violent crimes. For the last 20.5 years of his bureau career, he was a special agent assigned to the Miami division, where he served on investigative squads working transnational organized crime, transnational narcotics, healthcare fraud, and financial institution fraud. While working these matters, he had many international deployments to Afghanistan, Albania, Canada, Czech Republic, Dominican Republic, Egypt, Germany, Israel, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Romania. Upon being promoted to supervisory special agent, Kirk led joint interagency task forces where he managed 26 member teams comprised of FBI agents, task force officers, analysts, and support staff investigating high-profile transnational organized crime and major theft operations. Kurt earned accommodations for investigative excellence and leadership, including the FBI Medal of Excellence in 2018, Outstanding Federal Law Enforcement Officer in 2017, and the Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Force Officer in 2012, and other awards. He has a basic level proficiency in the Russian language and served as an instructor and advisor on organized crime matters to foreign governments. Now, before we get to the case review, let me take this opportunity to say a few words. I started FBI Retired Case File Review in January of 2016, almost 9 years ago. Its popularity took off later that year during and immediately after the presidential election of 2016, when people were hearing things about the FBI and FBI leadership and wanted to know, well, who the FBI is and what the FBI does. I guess my show was in the right place at the right time. It's quite obvious that in the next coming months, in the next coming years, the FBI will continue to be in the news for topics other than successful investigations. In honoring my commitment for this podcast not to be political or partisan, I'm going to continue to let the case reviews speak for the FBI and, at least on this podcast, speak for me. So I'm reaching out and asking you to continue to spread the word about FBI Retired Case File Review. I'm also always looking for interesting, unique, and yes, fascinating cases to review and share on the show. So if you know any retired FBI employees who have a case that tells the FBI story from predication to sentencing, and they also feel strongly about using their personal platform to highlight and showcase the FBI, please have them contact me. I'm looking for investigations from all violations and all programs, and I'm also hoping to feature more case reviews from women and minorities. I host and produce FBI Retired Case File Review because I love meeting and speaking with my former colleagues and sharing their stories. It's a privilege and an honor to continue to serve the FBI this way and promote the Bureau's mission to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution of the United States. As long as you keep listening, I'll keep recording. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to join my reader team, where I talk about crime fiction and you can learn about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Kurt McKenzie. Hey, Kurt, how are you?
I'm great, Jerry. It's good to be back talking to you again. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, well, we had a great time, which was almost 3 years ago, January of 2022, and you were on episode 251, and we talked about Operation Oxy Alley, which was a pill mill case.
That's correct.
That was really interesting. But at the time that we had that conversation, you did tell me about this case too, which I thought was really fascinating because it's something that I wasn't aware of, and I don't think most listeners are aware of. But I'm going to let you start where you want to start. I'm not going to tease because this case takes a lot of twists and turns, and I'm not sure which segment of this case you want to start with. So where do you want to start?
I tell you what, I'll start from the beginning and I'll provide a little background too. I was working organized crime in Miami at the time, and organized crime in Miami is mostly Eastern European criminal groups. We would deal with Russian gangsters a fair amount. Whenever you're dealing with the Russian gangsters, there's usually an intersection where the Russian intelligence services are involved as well, which would surprise many of your listeners, I'm sure. But it was just a bizarre marriage of government and gangster in South Florida sometimes. But the actions of the Russian government have been in the news lately. And I want to bring your listeners back to 2016 to talk about this particular scheme that we believe that the Russian government either helped to orchestrate or at the very least they were supporting. It started with local media reports highlighting what was then a new phenomenon of Russian women traveling to South Florida from Russia specifically to have children. The activity had been going on for at least a year or two, and there were several companies in South Florida that were involved in the activity. Let me be clear, South Florida wasn't the only place where this was occurring, but we had at the time and still have the second largest Russian-speaking population in the US. So the activity was centered in South Florida, specifically in a handful of cities, Sunny Isles Beach, that we used to jokingly call the Russian Riviera, in Hollywood, Florida, and also in Hallandale Beach, Florida. When we first heard about this activity, it reminded us there was a prior Department of Homeland Security investigation from California a few years before, and I want to say it was 2015. I don't know if you recall, this actually made national news where Chinese women were traveling to California from China to give birth.
Yes, I do remember that.
Yeah, and in that investigation, it was discovered that those women lied to consular officers at embassies and then lied to immigration officials about their pregnancy status in order to get the visas to come to the US. So the focus of that investigation was the fact that they lied. We weren't sure if we were going to have that here, but we decided to give it a look. So going back to our case, around the same time that the media reports were surfacing, I decided to reach out to an informant, what we call in the FBI a confidential human source, who did know about the activity and provided more details about what companies were involved in the activity. The CHS, or confidential human source, also identified potential cooperating witnesses that maybe we could contact, locations of some of these companies, and a little bit of background on the activity.
Before you move on, can you explain why this is a big deal? So a pregnant woman comes here and she gives birth to her baby. What's so bad about that?
What was alarming is that one of the things we figured out is these women were going right back to Russia. These children are not being raised here. So one of the things the CHS pointed out was that the Russian government was well aware of this activity and supported it. And to explain, what you have are ethnic Russians who are native-born US citizens who were then raised and indoctrinated in Russia. So you can imagine the Russian government could very easily conceptualize the long-term intelligence operation possibilities here, because a US citizen can apply for jobs at US intelligence agencies and receive a top secret security clearance or even run for president. So you can see that the Russians were playing the long game here if, in fact, the government was involved in this. And we quickly realized that this could be a potential national security threat and quite possibly a violation of U.S. criminal law as well.
All right, so I can understand why the Russian government would encourage this or would be eager to turn a blind eye and not stop anybody from doing it. But what do the mothers get out of it? What's the advantage of them coming here to have their babies and then going back home?
I'll talk a little bit about the politics of Russia, and I'll explain a little bit more about the financial portion of this. You have to understand that these clinics were charging a lot of money for these services, and your average, quote unquote, average Russian could not afford this. So every one of the people involved in this who were coming here to have the babies were very wealthy and or politically connected. In Russia, if you're politically connected and you're wealthy, you get that way with the blessing of the government. It's what I call a gangster democracy. If you run afoul of the government, though, you need to leave. And it was not uncommon for wealthy Russians at that time, and to this day still, to set up shop in other countries or have a way, an in, if you will, either buying property or birthright or whatever in other countries that they could go to immediately if they ran into trouble in Russia. This is very common and it still happens.
Okay, so this for them was, in a sense, a long game too, playing a long game, just in case I need to be able to come back here.
Correct.
Would it also have anything, because I know we have a lot of Americans who go to foreign countries to have surgery because it's cheaper. Is that part of it too, that having a baby in the United States is safer and better for them? Or is it totally about making sure their babies are born here so that they can become American citizens?
It is purely so they can have, there's a slang term that was used before to refer to people from other countries, but it really does apply here. But these are anchor babies. These Russians were wealthy enough that they could pay for the best medical care in Russia. So that was not the issue. And it's not that they were coming here going to the Mayo Clinic. They were not going to the finest medical institutions in South Florida. Their motivation was strictly economic, and potentially they would have an anchor here in the United States. And obviously the Russian government had a very keen interest in their activity.
This is fascinating. In preparing for your case review, I did some reading and I discovered, which was shocking to me, that the United States is only one of 3 top nations that automatically makes a baby born here in the United States or born in this country an automatic American citizen.
Correct.
I thought everybody did that.
No. In some countries, they don't care if you're born there or not. Unless your family goes back several generations and you're connected, you are not automatically granted citizenship. The United States is unique in many great ways. This is one of them. But there are people from other countries who do seek to exploit that for political gain and economic gain as well.
All right, I'm going to stop asking questions. I know because you want to get started on the case review, and I have all of these things going through my mind, but I'm going to let you continue and just sit back fascinated at this case because it's not something that you think about when you think about an FBI organized crime case or fraud case or whatever this is. I mean, how did you categorize it?
I categorize it as organized crime. It also did have a counterintelligence aspect to it, but for reasons I really can't articulate here, I can't get into it. But the counterintelligence squad in Miami that normally deals with issues like this did not want to pursue this. And there's a whole story behind that I won't get into. You and I have spoken before, and I think you understand that if I see something wrong, I'm going to do something about it. I'm not going to stand by and listen to somebody else's excuse for why they don't want to do something. So when I initiated this investigation, I worked on it with my new trainee at the time. To explain to your listeners, in the FBI, once you graduate from the academy as a new agent, you get assigned to a field office and they pair you up with an older, more experienced agent. One special agent, Irina, I'm not going to use her last name. She's still with the FBI doing fantastic things. But once she arrived in Miami, she was assigned to my organized crime squad and I was assigned as her training agent. So I remember having this discussion with her. She was excited about getting involved in this. She had a perspective on this that I did not possess. She was a brilliant new agent, but she also happened to have been born in Ukraine. So she was a native Russian and Ukrainian speaker who obviously understood the language and, more importantly, the cultural nuances of the people we would be targeting. I spoke a little Russian, but I certainly did not have the level of proficiency that she did. It's also important to note that Irina and I are both naturalized U.S. citizens. So cheating the system was something that was even more distasteful to us because we believe in the fairness of the system. Once we decided to start this investigation, we discovered that there are multiple companies and people in South Florida who were involved in this activity. In order to have the most impact, we decided to focus on 2 of the most prominent. The first was a company called Status Med Assistance, and the second was a company called Miami Mama. And we eventually named the investigation Operation Miami Mama. And I'll talk a little bit about the companies. Status Med was run by a man named Vlad Nevidimy, along with a woman named Vera Muzica and her husband, Alexei Muzica. Just for a little irony, Nevidimy, loosely translated, means invisible man. It's just bizarre that he would be involved in this activity. And Miami Mama was run by a man named Konstantin Lubnevsky, who brought it from the original owner, Ludmila Bogatov. What these companies did is they offered essentially a concierge service with a sliding scale of rates starting from $20,000 all the way up to $120,000. And it's important for your listeners to understand that very few people in Russia, regular Russians, do not have this kind of money. Only the wealthy and the politically connected. Both Irina and I decided to look at these companies' websites. Again, basic investigative techniques. We started off by looking at the websites. Turns out they had US and Russian versions of their websites with banners that read "Born in the USA" in both languages, along with an explanation of their services, their fees, their locations. What was even more telling, an explanation of the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, which outlines birthright citizenship.
It was very clear what they were doing and what they were selling.
Exactly. There was no mistaking what was going on here and what you were paying for, right? You're not coming there for medical services. You're coming here for your anchor child. And, eventually, if your child wants to branch off and join the intelligence services, he would be a superstar. She would be a superstar. The websites also had lots of photos of pregnant Russian women, recent mothers with testimonials, photos of the OBGYNs and some of the doctors and the staff of the clinics. And all these folks were obviously Russian speakers from former Soviet countries. And what was even more telling, the websites promised you help with obtaining both the US and Russian passports for your newborn. We took it to the next step. We initiated surveillance at both the locations of these companies over the course of several weeks. So we saw a lot of employee movement, as well as apparently pregnant customers going in and out. And I hesitate to use the term patients because these were more customers than anything else. Special Agent Irina even visited the clinics on a ruse in an undercover capacity just to ask about their services and got a lot of information that way. We also went and found several witnesses connected to these clinics and complainants, and I'll explain that in a little bit. The witnesses mentioned seeing a lot of pregnant Russian women in South Florida in those neighborhoods. The complainants talked about illegally subleased apartments. So again, to explain, this part of South Florida has a lot of wealthy, what we call in South Florida, snowbirds, right? People who have luxury condos, and in some cases, they'll sublease their units when they're not in town for the summer. These companies, the birth tourism companies, had a connection with several Russian-speaking realtors and business managers in the Russian-speaking neighborhoods in Miami that helped them find temporary housing for their customers. Again, no hotel stays for these mamas. They wanted the finest of the fine. And many times the owners of these units did not know that their units were being illegally subleased while they were out of town. So what would happen is a lot of the owners would complain that they returned to their apartments to find them obviously recently occupied without their knowledge or consent, and they would file complaints for burglary with the local police. We obviously had a connection with the local police, and we would hear these complaints, go and interview those folks. So we learned a lot about that angle of the investigation. Once we had some evidence from the surveillance, the interviews, we reached out to the State Department, specifically the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service. And that is the investigative arm of the State Department. We wanted to talk to them about what we were seeing and discuss possible immigration law and passport law violations being committed by these companies. Again, we weren't 100% sure what was going on, but we had a feeling that there was fraud somewhere involved in this process. So the activity was legal on its face, but again, my instincts were lit up at that point. So once we told DSS what was going on, they signed on as full partners, and those guys were fantastic. I'll call out Supervisory Special Agent Juan Ramirez and Special Agent Brian Baer, who's now a supervisor. They worked with us and they were fantastic partners. They helped us to unravel the process that the quote unquote patients were using to get into the US. They also told us once they joined the investigation, it appeared that some of these pregnant women were going to these companies' sister offices in Moscow. They would then go to the US Embassy for a visit with State Department consular officers while they were obviously pregnant to apply for and receive visas. So these women did not lie like the women in the Chinese case. And I'm hesitant to lay blame at another government agency, but sometimes it has to be done. The consular officers in this case granted visas to these women, even though they're obviously pregnant near term and coming to the United States to have their children, which is very concerning. DSS did not know about this activity. And obviously, well, it's not obvious, but I'll explain to your listeners again, and you're well aware of this, but federal agencies with investigative and enforcement arms, sometimes those parts of the agency don't talk to the administrative arm. Sometimes each one doesn't know what the other one's doing, and sometimes they conflict with their activity. And that was certainly the case here with the State Department.
I'm just trying to understand when a person applies for a visa and they're openly honest about the fact that they're in late term of their pregnancy, is the visa usually denied or is there more investigation to determine the purpose of them coming to the US? It sounds like there's usually a hold or a stop in the visa process when it's determined that the woman is pregnant.
Correct. So again, this may have changed, but you're talking almost 10 years ago, 8 years ago. And back then, you would not normally be granted a visa, depending on which country you're coming from. You would not be given a visa if you're, obviously 6 or 7 months pregnant.
And this would be like a tourist visa.
Correct. Right. But they would get a 90-day tourist visa, which was more than enough time to come here and have the child. If you remember me referring to the Chinese case, those women knew they couldn't apply for a visa while they were obviously pregnant. So they hid their pregnancies, they lied, and they came here and had their children. But for whatever reason, I can't comment for the State Department, but the State Department was allowing these pregnant Russian women to come to the United States to have their children. At least the consular officers were signing off on these applications.
I know you're not going to want to comment on this, so I'm making it very clear that you're not commenting on this. But for me, I kind of wonder if they were doing it in spite of the fact that they knew they shouldn't, what they might be getting out of it. But that's me questioning, but we'll move on.
Absolutely. I will be very clear that once we joined forces with the DSS and they realized what was going on, I asked them to elevate that to the highest levels of the State Department, what was going on here. You'll hear about some of the results of that later. Going back to DSS, once we paired up with them, we discussed what we were seeing. They explained to us their process, and they agreed with us that there was something wrong with this activity. Armed with this, our team, us and DSS, went to the U.S. Attorney's Office to present our initial findings and asked them to initiate a case on their end. And again, just to explain to your listeners, the FBI, the DSS, we don't prosecute cases, we investigate. So the federal prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office do that. We were shocked to see that there wasn't much interest in the case at first. And we even met with some resistance from the U.S. Attorney's Office. As I mentioned to you before, I can be very persistent and I can be a royal pain. I was convinced something was wrong here. I elevated this to the special agent in charge of the Miami division of the FBI. So the head agent for the Miami division. And I encouraged DSS to do the same with their special agent in charge. So once we went to both these gentlemen and explained to them what we were seeing, they were alarmed. And they agreed. We ended up having a big meeting with the U.S. attorney, not the assistants, but the U.S. attorney himself, to encourage him to open an investigation on their end. And we were successful that way. So again, a little lobbying. We got them to agree. And they assigned us a phenomenal AUSA. I cannot say enough about this lady. Her name was Jessica Obenoff. And she was assigned to this case, and she was a rock star. With her guidance, our investigation continued. One of the things we found out is that the women, after they paid their initial deposit for whatever package that I explained to you they get to the US, they're given housing for 30 to 90 days. They're given a driver. They're assigned an OBGYN. They're even given a translator. And they were also given assistance, as I mentioned before, with obtaining passports, birth certificates, all that stuff. So we had a long conversation with DSS about the process for obtaining a passport for a baby. When you're working fraud cases in the FBI, usually fraud is about compromising a system. So it's important that you understand the details of that system. So DSS explained to us that to get a passport for a baby, both parents have to sign the application. Many of these women were younger, second or third wives or girlfriends with older, wealthier partners back in Russia. And many of these men could not or did not make the trip here. So we went to the Department of Homeland Security and asked for records from the TEX system, which, as you know, is an entry system. It records every person entering the United States and all their documentation. When we looked at the TEX records, we saw a discrepancy between the entry records dates and the dates of the father's signatures on the passport applications for the babies. So the companies were claiming that the signatures on the State Department forms were personally witnessed by them. It turns out this was not true. And in fact, they actually forged some of the signatures of the fathers outright. So that gave us justification in early 2017 to obtain a search warrant for the email accounts of Vlad Nevidimy, who was again the president of Status Medical. And these emails provided evidence that he, Vera Muzica, and several others knew that some of the fathers wouldn't be present, but that they conspired to falsify the applications anyway. The emails showed additional criminal activity by Nevidimy. Specifically, he'd been purchasing restricted night vision rifle scopes and other weapons accessories on behalf of some of his wealthy customers and shipping them to Russia in violation of U.S. law.
Okay, well, we had to stop here for a second because you're looking at these emails trying to find evidence for your anchor baby birthing scam case. And now all of a sudden you see these emails about illegal shipment of night vision and other military like equipment. What are you saying to yourself when you look at this?
You can't make this stuff up. You just can't. It was just insane. We even went as far as once we saw this, we advised our prosecutor, and we even got a second search warrant specifically to search for emails related to that activity, right? We sort of separated a little bit.
I'm thinking about this, and it's like you had the excitement of seeing and being able to prove the fraud. In the case of the women coming from China, they lied. This case, you weren't sure, but now you have the deception because you have the forged signatures. So you're already excited and feeling great about your case because of that. And then you get this extra bonus case.
It was just bizarre, right? As I've told you before, you've interviewed enough agents where you know you can't predict cases sometimes. They will take a left turn and take you down paths you never expected, which is half the fun of these investigations, to be honest with you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So in 2017, armed with this evidence, we charged Vlad Nevidimy, Vera Muzica, and one of their employees named Daria Arshova in a 15-count indictment, charged them with conspiracy to commit passport fraud for making false statements on the application. We also served search warrants in person at both companies in June of 2017. And one of the employees at Miami Mama, a gentleman named Evgeny Kovtunenko, we charged him by information, and he pled guilty very quickly and admitted his guilt. The rest of them decided they wanted to go to trial in early 2018. Mr. Nevidimy got wise and he pled guilty early on. He admitted his guilt. He was actually sorry for what he did. He was a naturalized U.S. citizen and told me, he was ashamed that he was doing this and this was not right, and he wanted to make it right to his credit. And he decided to testify against his co-conspirators. He ended up getting 2 years in prison with supervised release of 3 years. Musica and Arshova were found guilty at trial. They were looking at a max penalty of probably 5 years in federal prison. Musica was sentenced to 9 months with a year of supervised release, and Arshova was sentenced to, I think, 2 years probation. So it's also important to note that we didn't stop at the clinics.
Why did they get less time than your cooperator?
He was the mastermind. Their involvement was lesser, their culpability was lesser. So if you remember, under sentencing guidelines, you tend to get more time based on your responsibility, what role you play in the criminal organization or in the conspiracy. Even though he pled guilty, he did get more time. They went to trial, they lost. Typically, they would have gotten more time. We didn't bring these charges with the intention of putting people in jail for 20 years like you would in a drug case. We wanted to bring these charges to shut down this activity. That was the whole point. If you could get felony conviction and get publicity, you win.
Well, for those who aren't aware, you did get a lot of publicity. I've found lots of articles and TV news clips, and I will include links to those in the show notes for this episode because it was really fascinating to read all about this, and they kind of supplement what you're telling us here today.
Absolutely. We got a lot of local television news coverage and a lot of national television news coverage. There were articles written. This was well publicized, which was a good thing, and I'll explain why in a little bit. One thing to note, too, that we didn't just stop with the birth tourism portion of it. We also indicted a Russian citizen named Dmitry Makarenko with conspiracy to traffic night vision rifle scopes I spoke about earlier from the U.S. to Russia in violation of several arms control regulations.
So he was the one who had made the request for them to do this.
Correct. He was not in the country at the time, so we did not arrest him. We decided to be patient and wait for him because I assumed he was going to come back in the U.S. He had a child who was born here through this company. He had his anchor. He liked coming to the U.S. He loved Miami, as many people do. And we knew he was going to come back at some point. I was actually a little caught off guard because he decided to show up in the U.S. territory of Saipan for vacation. In December of 2018, the FBI locked him up at the airport there. What was interesting about his arrest in Saipan, I'm happy. My case is going along well. We're doing our thing. I'm not really concerned about outside publicity at that point. But something very strange happened about 2 months later. In January of 2019, the Russian government engaged in their usual disinformation campaigning, and they put out a public statement to global media claiming that we, the US government, unlawfully arrested Mr. Makarenko in retaliation for the arrest of Paul Whelan. If your listeners remember, he was an American who was arrested in Russia and charged with espionage back in 2018. He was actually, fortunately, just recently released in a prisoner exchange. This was obviously false because we indicted Makarenko over a year beforehand. And more importantly, we had what the Russians didn't have against Mr. Whelan, which was evidence. Mr. Makarenko was extradited back to Miami. He ended up pleading guilty because he was smart. He was sentenced to time served, and he agreed to pay a fine, I want to say maybe $50,000. And more importantly, he agreed to return all of the night vision scopes he purchased to the US and turn them over to the FBI. And at that point, he was released from federal prison and he returned to Russia. As I mentioned, there was a great deal of publicity, local and national television coverage about this. The publicity helped to shine a light on the activity and helped to reduce the activity. But more importantly, right around that time, sometimes coincidence is your best friend. The Trump administration at the time got into a disagreement with the Putin administration in Russia. I don't recall off the top of my head what the problem was, but it led to the expulsion of diplomats on both sides, several diplomats. What happened now, there are fewer people at the US embassies in Moscow to process these applications. So between the publicity that we got shutting down a couple of these companies and the diplomatic row, this activity slowed to a crawl, right? So having Russian women fly to the United States to have children almost completely stopped at that point, which was good. But the problem is our calculation is we believe a total of about 600 children were born with the assistance of just these two companies. Remember, I mentioned there were other smaller ones doing this as well. Many of them ended up going out of business. But again, over 600 children born in the United States immediately ferried back to Russia, who are being raised in Russia, who are now US citizens, who can, if you're the Russian government playing your intelligence service long game, they have an important ace up their sleeve at this point. And this has serious potential future ramifications for US national security, as you can imagine.
I'm thinking of the TV show, The Americans.
Exactly.
Where you have Russians posing as citizens coming into the United States for intelligence services activities. We make it easy.
We do make it easy.
So there's 600 plus potential counterintelligence spies that could be coming in. What time period were these companies open?
These children were all born and these companies were all operating between roughly 2015 and 2018. Again, the activity slowed to a crawl shortly thereafter. So the volume is nowhere near what it was before. And the State Department hopefully was embarrassed into changing some of their processes. But again, these 600 kids, and this is just South Florida we're talking about. I'm sure this was happening in Miami and other parts of the country, probably not to the scale it was here. But these are 600 children who, not very far from now, in another 10 years or so, will be old enough to join the Russian military, join the Russian intelligence services, because you can join the intel services in Russia at age 18. I need your listeners to think about the potential implications of that.
Yeah, I had to pause a little bit there to think about it. I mean, it is kind of frightening. The question that I have that keeps going through my mind is the fact that you were able to detect that there was fraud, that the father's signatures had been forged. Does that make the citizenship invalid?
It's a great question. It's perfectly logical. No, it does not, unfortunately.
Oh.
Birthright citizenship is birthright citizenship. I'm not an attorney. I don't pretend to be one, but my understanding after talking to the attorneys, the only way you can revoke citizenship is if somebody was a naturalized citizen and defrauded the government at the time of their naturalization. These were native-born Americans, so there was no way to do that. What we could do, and what we did do, what State Department did, is they voided all of the passports in the cases where we could determine that there was fraud. And it's important to understand, of the 600 children I told you, the cases that we reviewed, not all of them were fraudulent because unfortunately, a lot of this activity was legal on its face. We focused on the fraudulent ones, and that's where people were arrested and charged. And we used that as a tool to shut down the companies. But yeah, those handful of passports for the cases we charged were voided. So those children can't travel. They have to go back to a U.S. embassy or consulate to get a new passport.
And would there be any restrictions or issues for them doing that?
I don't know. Honestly, you'd have to ask the State Department because, again, these children would have to go to a U.S. embassy in Moscow to get a new, or, wherever they are in Russia to get a new passport. And at that point, I didn't ask State Department if they set up a database or anything like that. But at that point, it would be revealed that this is why they don't have a passport, even though they were born in the United States. Or the State Department consular officer would be able to see that there was a previously voided passport that was voided due to fraud.
So those cases where you weren't able to prove are where the father was actually in the country and signed the passport. All of those children who will soon be adults, they are definitely American citizens with valid American passports.
Unfortunately, yes, that is correct.
What did you call this again?
We call this case Operation Miami Mama. Again, that was one of the names of one of the companies. We thought it was catchy, and we ended up shutting that company down anyway. But yeah, that's what we called it.
And the actual things that they were doing was called.
We refer to it as a birth tourism case.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it's not something that I ever thought about. And after the case is so successful and people recognize now the ramifications of letting this happen, I'm sure that you kind of could strut around a little bit, giving yourself a well-deserved pat on the back for those who at first were not interested in you moving forward with this case.
I never do that, Jerry, because I had a job to do in service to the American people, and I took that very seriously. And as you can understand, I'm sure you ran into this from time to time. If you were somebody that was not on the side of right and trying to do the right thing for the American people, I had no patience with you. So I was going to try to convince you, bulldoze you, intimidate you, whatever I could to get you to do your job and do the right thing. And I did my job. And I'm glad I did my job. I was very fortunate to be an agent and to be able to make a difference.
Well, you're a better person than I am because I probably would have taken the opportunity to do the touchdown dance at the very end.
I will admit at the end of the trial, we probably did a little bit of that.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, the guilty convictions. There was definitely a little celebration after the guilty conviction. So
Excellent. If you have any photos from this case,
I do not have photos. All of the search warrant materials and all that, obviously, that's still in the possession of the FBI. But there is a fair amount of video news clips and stills from the local media, especially, who took several photos and did some interviews. There should be a fair trove of images on the internet for you.
very good. I thank you so very much. This was a nice, sweet, quick, and easy, but really fascinating case review. I think I'm going to call it birth tourism.
Correct. Birth tourism is what we call the process, and we call the investigation Operation Miami Mama.
Is there anything else with this that we want to expand on?
No, I think we pretty much covered everything.
The last time we spoke, we covered my standard questions of when and why you joined the FBI. But because this case is a lot different from the pill mill case, because there are two different types of violations, why don't we do that again? So the question, when and why did you join the FBI?
I joined the FBI in 1997. I was actually recruited. I was a scientist at the time, if you can believe that. And I'd met some FBI agents, got to know them. And this was back in the day when you could hand somebody a resume and things would happen. My background was particularly interesting to the FBI for a few reasons, but I got a call from the FBI laboratory one day, flown in for interviews and passed the background and everything. And I started working in the DNA analysis unit of the FBI laboratory in 1997. So I was a civilian scientist at first. And I did that for about 3.5 years before the opportunity to go to Quantico to be an agent came up. Everybody knows about the FBI, obviously, but it was never a life goal per se. I was happy, working in my laboratory, doing my thing. But I thank God for the opportunity to serve. And it was a hell of an adventure, as you can testify to.
You would think that as an agent with your background, there are still a lot of different violations that you could focus on, but you can't get much further than being a scientist in a lab and then working Russian organized crime.
This is true, but I will say the FBI did not let my talents go to waste. If you remember the unfortunate, what we in the FBI referred to as the Amerithrax investigation, when somebody, Bruce Ivins, we suspect, released anthrax and killed several people and sickened others. I was actually part of that investigation. I was a member of what the FBI used to call the Hazardous Materials Response Team, which essentially was a chemical and biological weapons countermeasures program. And I was a member of that program for about 10 years. So I did, as a collateral duty, work on several cases involving chemical and biological warfare agents in the country and around the world, actually.
Oh, well, that's good to hear. I don't remember. You probably told me that the last time, but for some reason I didn't recall. And I have done an interview on the Amerithax investigation.
That was a huge investigation, as I'm sure your interviewee would have mentioned to you. And there were dozens of us assigned to it. I was just one of many. But again, I was with the hazmat program for about 10 years. I was involved in that investigation starting in 2001.
All right, I'm going through all of my Scotts because I can't think of the investigation name, but I know the case agent's name, Scott Decker.
I remember Scott.
If anybody's interested in learning more about the Amerithax investigation, I did interview one of the agents who actually had a doctorate in human genetics, and he worked on that case, and that was episode 115. What came first, working the Russian organized crime or working the Hill Mill drug investigation out of drug squad in Miami?
Believe it or not, they were both off the same squad. After I left the laboratory, I came to Miami. I had worked white collar investigations for about 6 years. I worked narcotics for a couple of years. But what held my interest the most was organized crime for several reasons, but partially because those subjects were interesting to me. They were violent and they were brilliant at the same time. They were well organized. They were worthy targets. And the pill mill investigation we treated as an organized crime case just happened to be native born Americans. Most of our other subjects on that squad were from Eastern Europe, but they were both treated the same way. And I worked both of them on the same squad. I spent about 13 years working organized crime. My last 3, I ended up becoming the supervisor of the organized crime task force. I did retire as a supervisor of the task force after spending several years working organized crime.
Well, so now you have this unbelievable, vast experience working all these different matters for the FBI, white collar, drugs, organized crime, the science stuff.
The hazmat team, so hazardous materials response, they've changed the name since then. Usually local police or fire departments, you hear hazmat team, they clean up gasoline spills and things like that. We did nothing of the sort. We were strictly relegated to suspected incidents or investigations involving chemical or biological weapons.
That sounds fascinating too. The point I was trying to make was you have all of this experience and then you retire. I hope that you were able to continue to put it to good use. So what are you doing now?
I retired in 2021. I decided to take some well-deserved rest for a few months. As I'm sure all of the agents you've spoken to will tell you, we are restless people. And if we don't have something to do, we get a little edgy.
Oh, I know it.
It's a personality defect that works well in the job. But fortunately for me, I was hired in 2022 by a global database software company. I am now their director of physical security. It's been a fantastic adventure working for them, going to their offices all over the world, writing policy, creating procedures, just setting up their entire physical security program. So it's truly been an adventure working with them. And it's a great job.
Well, I want to thank you for coming back. I know there's still another case of yours that I'm really, really interested in.
I have a few.
Yeah, that still has to do with Russian citizens. It's the kind that I used to do, a great fraud investigation. So maybe in a year or two, we'll have you back again to do that case.
That would be fantastic.
All right. So we're at the point now where I like to give my guest the last word. What would you like to say?
I just like to say thank you. I'm grateful, and I want to say thank you to you for giving me and all of the other retired agents the opportunity, giving us this platform to talk about the accomplishments of the FBI. Obviously, nowadays in the news, we take a beating, but it's important for the American people to understand the real work that goes on when they don't even realize it. I want to say thanks to my former partner and trainee, Irina. I want to say thank you to Jessica Obanoff, our phenomenal assistant U.S. attorney, as well as our 2 agents from the DSS, Juan Ramirez and Brian Baer, who, without all those people, none of this would have been possible.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Kurt McKenzie and links to articles and case-related images about Russian birth tourism. Did you know Argentina is the current location for pregnant Russian women to go to have their babies? I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, But if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.